Hello and welcome to a Nautilus Custom Guitars tutorial. This is a short walkthrough on how I dye some of my guitars. I've been using dyes to color my instruments for about 6 years. I primarily use Kita and trans tint, and I mix them in 70% isopropyl alcohol. I used to use a 100% water base, then switched to a 50-50 water alcohol, and now I just primarily use alcohol. It really just comes down to a personal preference. Each mixture has its pros and cons, and ultimately you just have to decide what works best for you or the build. I've gone through a lot of trial and error over the years with figuring out a good application technique. One really important aspect that I never took into consideration when I started was how the wood reacts when receiving the mixture. I used to just brute force the color into the wood and then spend a lot of time and energy sanding and restaining afterwards. The main problem with that technique is when you press into the wood, you compress the fibers and decrease the ability for the dye to penetrate evenly into the wood. This also runs the risk of having a more blotchy finish. Instead, if you saturate the rag and then lightly run it across the wood, it will naturally absorb the dye and penetrate deeper and give a much more even result. There are of course a few other factors to take into consideration, such as wood color and the thickness and figure. A lighter color wood is going to yield a more vibrant and true representation of your mixture, whereas a darker or more lateral tinted wood is going to greatly skew the results. The thickness of the veneer or cap will also be a large determining factor in how well the figure jumps out. The thinner the wood, the less perceived depth of field you'll have. There's also a risk of sanding through it or running into glue spots from binding or soak through from when it was pressed. I use acetone when I put on my bindings so that I don't have to worry about glue spots. I'm moving the dye across the grain but with the figure. This allows the dye to get deeper into the lower grain and create more contrast. That will in turn give you more of a 3D effect. I'm also starting with a lighter version of the final green. This is to compensate for the burst effect. Since I will be pulling a darker green in from the edge, I will inevitably have some mix of the darker green in with the lighter center. I can see the color that I want in my mind, and I know that if I put it on the guitar that way, it will get darker than I want. So I start with a lighter tint to compensate. Once the first coat of stain is done, I will let it set overnight and fully dry. I want a more subtle burst on this guitar, so I'm not going to do a hard lined edge. I only dip the rag 3 times into the dye initially, 1 to saturate and 2 light dips periodically after that. I just want to establish the outer edge. The rest is blending and feathering. If you're new to applying dyes, don't panic if the line between the 2 dyes doesn't go away immediately. It just takes a little bit of patience. There are several ways to get a burst effect, most involving layers and then sanding back. My goal here is to do as little as possible. If you don't have any sanding scratches or glue marks, then when you put that first layer of color on, it looks amazing. The burst gives it more dimension, but every time you add a layer, you also lose some definition. I want the green to be translucent, but still vibrant. If I have to sand, I run the risk of making an uneven finish and then having to add more stain. I'm alternating between the light and the dark rags and using the residual moisture in them to move the dye and get it to blend. I'll also be using some denatured alcohol here in a moment. The important part in this stage is to keep the rag moving. This will keep it from drying out and setting. If you do run into a spot where the line is being stubborn, just use a clean rag soaked with isopropyl or denatured alcohol. That will help get the dye moving again so it can be feathered. It's important to keep in mind the clear coat that you're going to use. Certain finishes could make things look darker or even change the overall tint and hue. When you work with figured wood, the type of clear coat plays a huge role in how well that grain jumps out. You can tease some of that depth out of the thinner veneers with a good high gloss coat. Likewise, you can use an oil finish and also get a unique and stunning result. A few important tips when using dyes. In regards to Kita, they come in powder form in red, blue, yellow, brown, and black. I get the best results when mixing the powders together into the alcohol as opposed to mixing up the main colors first and then combining them as liquids. I've also found that the order in which you mix them will drastically affect the color as well. For example, yellow and blue make green. But if you start with a yellow base and then slowly add in small amounts of blue, you will get a lighter version of green. Vice versa, if you start with a blue base and slowly add in the yellow, you get a darker forest type green. Trans tint dyes come in a concentrated liquid form, and I usually follow the same method when mixing them. I will typically use a half teaspoon to measure out my quantities. Be sure to wear some gloves and try not to get any on your clothes. The denatured alcohol here acts as a chemical sandbag. It will help to blend and fade from the dark to the light, and it will also pull off some of that color that didn't penetrate. This helps aid in the translucent part of the finish and gets the definition of that grain to really jump out. If you have any comments or suggestions, please feel free to leave them below. And if you enjoyed the videos, leave a like and subscribe. As always, thanks for watching.